I was blown away. Jung said, "You are symbols." And they say, "We are real and we are not symbols."
This is Becca Tarnas, assistant professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Her dissertation was about the phenomenal connection between the Red Books of Carl Jung and the lesser-known Red Books of J.R.R. Tolkien.
Tolkien is describing the Eye of Sauron, and Jung is describing what he calls the Eye of the Evil One.
On this channel, I, Curt Jaimungal, interview researchers regarding their theories of reality with rigor and technical depth. I'm thrilled to bring you this masterclass in the intersection between Jung and Tolkien.
That sounds insane.
We touch on archetypes, symbols, the shadow, and even psychedelic experiences, how they can feel real, but
then we kind of dismiss it. It was just a fantasy. It was just something I made up. It's much more subtle.
How do we know when to integrate something versus let something go?
Jung would say that one has to be careful because it can take you too far away from reality.
Professor, what did you discover about Jung and Tolkien?
Well, the story begins... In some ways, the story could begin when I was 9 years old and first encountered Tolkien's work. The Hobbit was read to me when I was in 4th grade, and I was deeply captivated by this story. I was having these experiences as a child where the names in the story were bringing forward this sense of memory, but a memory of something that I didn't actually have. So I'd hear names like Rivendell or Dale or Mirkwood. I thought, this sounds so familiar. I feel like I've been here. And I was completely fascinated with Tolkien's stories. And several years later, read The Lord of the Rings and had just a fully immersive experience in reading Tolkien's work. And as a teenager, I actually was having these experiences where I felt like, I was living my normal teenage life. And at the same time, I felt overlaid in some ways with a kind of imaginal, immersive experience in Middle-earth. And I didn't think too much about it at the time. I was young enough that this was just kind of how life was unfolding. And as I got older, I tried to set Tolkien aside, not in any kind of strict way, but just thinking, it's time to grow up, it's time to move on. And then in 2009, Carl Jung's Red Book was published. And I think I first encountered it in the New York Times spread that was done on the Red Book. And I thought, this looks really familiar. And there were two reasons it felt familiar. One, the title, the Red Book, aligned with something in Tolkien's work. And in the context of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, the story is written down in a book that's passed on from generation to generation called The Red Book of Westmarch. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, a red book, that's quite interesting. And the other thing was when I actually got my hands on a copy of the Red Book, I felt like these illustrations look a lot like Tolkien's style of illustrations. And so at first I just thought, those are some interesting parallels. There's a red book and a red book. The style of the illustrations are similar. But then I began to dive more deeply into it and realized that there were these parallels in timing between when Jung went through his Red Book period, which started in 1913, where he began having these immersive visionary experiences, these fantasies that he started working with using the practice of active imagination. And then he started recording those experiences. And there was a parallel with the younger Tolkien's life. This was before he'd ever written any of his stories, but he had a sketchbook that he called the Book of Ishnis. And there's not much explanation with the drawings in the Book of Ishnis. They just have really kind of evocative titles like Silent, Enormous, and Immense, or Beyond.
We'll overlay some of those images on screen for the viewers to see.
Oh, perfect. That'll be wonderful. So with those images in the Book of Ishnis, he was doing them at the same time that Jung was recording his experiences. And it was out of doing those drawings. And then in the following few years, Tolkien began to write the first stories of Middle-earth. And, these are precursors to what would become The Lord of the Rings, but there were all these different tales that he wrote down. And what I began to find reading Jung's Red Book and Tolkien's legendarium of Middle-earth in tandem with each other was more and more of these parallels came forward. Parallels in not just timing and imagery, but in story pattern, in figures who were parallel between the two. And this started me down a road of wondering, well, what does this mean? What does this indicate? What does this tell us about the nature of the human psyche or the nature of the imagination? Where does this material come from? So that was the beginning of exploring the connection. And then I went on to write my doctoral dissertation on it.
And which of these rhymes is most difficult to explain?
In what sense?
Which is too much of a parallel for a skeptic or someone hearing that's just saying, oh, these are just coincidences? I mean, any two books have a variety of connections and disconnections.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think any one of them on their own can be explained. It's the sheer volume. So when we look at the similarity in how they each drew a red eye, for example, on the one hand, Tolkien is describing the Eye of Sauron, and Jung is describing what he calls the Eye of the Evil One in the context of the Red Book. And those parallels, you're just like, why are they talking about the Eye of the Evil One? Why this connection between the eye, which is so symbolic of many different things, and evil? Now, some of this can be explained, of course, using a theory of archetypes along the lines of what Jung was doing. We can see this with parallels between Tolkien's character of Gandalf, the wise old man, the wizard, and Jung's idea of psychological archetypes and the archetypal figure of the wise old man, who first came to Jung as Philemon, this figure in the Red Book who very much acted as a guide for Jung. He called him his guru, or he kind of made that type of connection, this inner figure who guided him. And so on the one hand, we can see, okay, well, they seem to both have this archetypal figure standing behind them of the wise old man. But then when we get into the text, there's even more parallels between them, just in how they appear, how they talk to the figures that they're in relationship to, whether that's Philemon and Jung, or Gandalf and other characters in The Lord of the Rings or in The Hobbit. So I think for me, what became quite compelling about it, that it wasn't just mere coincidence, or that they're drawing only on external sources that are inspiring to them, is, again, the sheer number of parallels. And then also the way they each speak about the experiences. Because, Tolkien, for example, will acknowledge the many different myths and legends and stories that inspired him in his writing. Jung was extremely well educated in terms of mythology, religion, folklore, and so forth. So there's a lot of kind of parallel external influence on them. But they're describing their experiences as coming from within. So Jung is having these experiences through the practice of what he calls active imagination. Tolkien is not as explicit as Jung is talking about his process. Makes sense. Jung is a psychologist. He's interested in what stands behind the vision-making capacity. Tolkien is a little bit more veiled in how he talks about it, but he often says he never felt like he was inventing his stories. He felt like they arose within him as given, and that as those would come, that they already existed somewhere. That's how he described it, that there was this place somewhere that they existed. And then he would write them down, and as he would write them and rework the stories, the links between them would grow. So they're both speaking about something that's emerging from within them, something that's emerging internally. And that was another thing that I found quite compelling between the two of them, was that not only are there these parallels in images and figures and timing, but they're speaking about their experiences in a somewhat comparable way, that it's not just, oh, I'm simply making this up, I'm coming up with a story. There's something internal happening there. And that was ultimately what I found most interesting, most compelling about it.
One of the largest debates among mathematicians in the philosophy of math is whether math is being discovered, that's like Platonism,
Uh-huh.
versus created by us. So are you referencing something similar when you say that it has been emerged inside, or is that a third? It's neither created nor discovered.
I would say that it's a third, and this idea that the agency is neither just within the human being who is making the discovery or within what is being discovered or disclosed, but there's a kind of co-creation or a participation between the two. So I would say that it's a third in the sense that you're describing that. For example, with mathematics, which is not an area of expertise for me, but I think the way you're describing that is quite parallel to this, that there's something real there about the nature of the world that is being uncovered, but it's not being uncovered in a fully objective sense. It's being enacted. It's being called forth by the mathematician or by the author or the artist or whomever is engaging with it, that we have an agential role to play in that relationship. Yeah.
Can you walk the audience through what it means to experience something within? Now, it sounds so intuitive. We close our eyes and we feel something within. But as Tolkien meant it, that he was discovering something within versus without. So what is that? Your eyes open versus closed? Give an intuition, please, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I will. It is a tricky thing to describe, and at the same time, it's one of the most innate things as well. And actually, I will say in my study of imagination, I've learned a lot of my own biases around what I think imagination is. So the term imagination, first of all, is rooted in the word image. So we would often think of, okay, the imagination is image-based. But what I've learned over the years of teaching on imagination, on the practice of active imagination, is that, some people have what's called aphantasia. They don't see internal images. Other people see them so vividly, it's like being fully immersed in another world. So I want to kind of keep that spectrum in mind as I'm saying this. But imagination or turning inward it's probably easier with eyes closed. We could start with that because then you're blocking off the external stimulus that comes in through your visual sight. And for a lot of people, what happens when you close your eyes and just allow your consciousness to open, kind of entering into what I would call a daydream or a reverie state, often just images will spontaneously start to come up within one's, I don't want to say mind, because I think mind is a little bit more narrow and specific, related to cognition, to thinking. Imagination is more broadly connected to psyche. And so you allow just something to bubble up through the psyche and observe it. And often what emerges will be what seems like random images, things that don't feel connected. For some people, it can be as simple as kind of blurry colors that might feel correlated with their emotions. For others, it might be flashes of memory. Those, again, might be kind of blurry. And then for others still, they might be crystal clear, as though you're watching a film within yourself. And for other, such as Jung, they might be so clear and multi-dimensional that you can step right into the drama itself surrounding you. Jung, I think, was a little bit more rare in that totally immersive capacity. And what I've gotten the sense of from Tolkien is that he might have been similar too. But for others, that inner experience can take the form more of something auditory. You can hear inner voices or words, not in the sense that we mean when we describe, say, schizophrenia or something. I'm hearing voices that feel separate from me or commanding me to do something, but just simply a voice or a narrative. And here's the part where it's very tricky to describe, and you have to be really honest with yourself, is what I am experiencing something that my individual kind of egoic self am coming up with in the moment? Or is it coming somehow from beyond me? Am I aware of this not being sourced in myself? And I think that's a very tricky demarcation line to hold, because our ego, our mind, our thoughts, they come in all the time. It's very similar to practicing meditation, of kind of learning to observe our thoughts and then wondering, well, who's the witness here? But instead of that process of emptying that we see in so many meditation practices, it's more of a process of allowing something to emerge and being present with it, allowing images to emerge, or words, or colors, or so forth and so forth. So, but that difference, I think, is really important when it feels like, oh, am I cognitively coming up with something or making something up? Or is something genuinely coming through me that I've never encountered before? And Jung would describe this, again, going back to Philemon, this figure within the Red Book whom he encountered, who acted as a guide. He said, Philemon knew things that I never knew, that I couldn't know. And that's when he was able to realize this is something that is separate from him. Not completely autonomous, separate in that sense, but something that is not just a subpersonality of C.G. Jung, not a facet of him only, but something that he's come into relationship with internally instead of externally.
What's the relationship between this imaginal realm and lucid dreams, or just dreams?
Oh, I like that parallel because I think it is a really valuable one. The parallels I would want to draw are with dreaming. What we would consider kind of the regular dreams of sleep were, of course, asleep, and it seems as though the unconscious is expressing itself in that state, but we are not engaged within it in a conscious way. Mm-hmm. We're just simply kind of carried along, witness to it, part of it, but not aware that we're in a dream. And I think that that's parallel in the waking state to something like daydream or reverie. You know, those moments where you're lying on the couch, or you're bored, or you have a moment to yourself, which it feels like we have less and less of these days. Mm-hmm. And something just kind of passively moves through you. And you kind of bear witness to it. You don't really engage with it. It's kind of a fantasy that's emerging. Well, that would be one parallel I would draw. And then the other parallel I would draw would be between lucid dreaming, where one awakens within the dream, but you're still asleep, but your consciousness is awake. You go, oh, I'm here. I'm in a dream. And a parallel between that and what Jung called active imagination. So active imagination being this practice of consciously evoking the fantasies and then entering into them, engaging with them, speaking with what or who emerges and participating in it. That's like a waking version of lucid dreaming. But we're awake instead of asleep. So I think it's our level with lucid dreaming and active imagination, it's our level of consciousness and active engagement that is the key part. Whereas the other two, kind of daydream or reverie and natural dreaming of sleep, are more just the unconscious emerging through us.
I prepare extensively, often for months, for a single podcast. If you notice that we go into detail, ask questions that are in depth, or that the conversation is technical, part of the reason is that I use 11 labs to transcribe my own notes. And then as I'm going for a walk or as I'm out driving, I listen to my own notes back to me, read with a natural voice, so that I can prepare by hearing from different perspectives. Actually, even right now, if you click the subtitles, you'll notice the quality's increased. We even have speaker labels to tell you when someone's speaking, who's speaking, etc. And if you're a business, they even rethink the whole customer experience with 11 agents. That's a voice AI agent that listens, understands, resolves, looks up accounts, processes requests, and escalates intelligently. Its natural sounding voice and low latency responses are immediate. It runs 24/7 in over 30 languages. If you run a business with any kind of customer operations, support, sales, or onboarding, you can start with a demo at 11labs.io/toe. See what 11 agents can do for your specific workflows. Guided rollout capacity is limited each quarter, so if you want to be one of the first companies with a customer experience that people actually talk about in a good way, now's the time. 11labs.io/toe. That's ELEVENLABS.io/TOE. So, something just happened recently. The Economist sat down with Elon Musk, who told him that AI will surpass human intelligence within 5 years, and then in 10, humans won't be running the world. It went viral, and I recommend you check it out. See, The Economist is more than a magazine. Actually, I subscribe to The Economist's annual subscription. Their science and AI coverage is among the best that I've found anywhere, and I say that as someone who reads plenty of it. They even covered how dark energy may be weakening with time. If that holds up, it completely changes our understanding of the universe's fate. Those are exactly the kinds of questions that we explore every week on this channel. Now, The Economist is, of course, known for global affairs, both political and economic reporting. Interestingly and flatteringly, TOE is one of the only podcasts that The Economist partners with. So, as a TOE listener, you get their summer sale, 50% off the annual subscription, but only until August 17th, 2026. That's not a deal they have just anywhere. Head to economist.com/TOE, TOE, to subscribe. That's economist.com/TOE for 50% off the annual subscription. When I was practicing transcendental meditation, after doing it for 45 minutes, it takes a long time to get to the state. I would get to a state that was much like lucid dreaming, but it's extremely difficult. I developed a technique, which I can tell you about another time, if you like, about lucid dreaming, because I can have lucid dreams relatively straightforwardly and one after the other, almost 5 or 6 in a row. Are there methods that you guide other people through to actively imagine? What is the protocol here?
So I actually did develop a method of guiding others into the practice of active imagination. And I put it together by gleaning what Jung wrote in there's a book actually called Jung on Active Imagination that's edited by a scholar named Joan Chodorow. And it's only about, probably just over half an inch thick. And it's basically a compilation of everything that Jung wrote on active imagination. So drawn from his books, some letters, some lectures. It's surprising how little he wrote on it, considering it's so central to his work, to how he worked with his patients, actually, that he would support his patients in the practice of active imagination. And so based on everything I could find that Jung said about active imagination, I wanted to develop a way to guide students and to guide workshop practitioners into a kind of easy preliminary form of active imagination. I wouldn't say that this is the deepest form one can engage in the way, again, that Jung was, or that he was doing with his patients, or someone who's doing this regularly. And the first time I brought this to a workshop, I was terrified that this wouldn't work. I thought, I want to give people an experience of active imagination. I want them to have a sense of what I'm talking about with Jung and Tolkien, but I have no idea. And so it was really, truly a leap of faith when I brought this practice in, guided participants first to kind of like yoga nidra, kind of moving through their bodies, becoming really aware of the state of their body and then letting it go, allowing themselves to physically relax. And then I wanted something that would both be kind of like a guidepost, but not too suggestive, and would just invite them first to attune to their emotions and be present with whatever emotion was there. And then just simply to allow that emotion to transform within them. And this is something that Jung also said, if you hold an image in your inner sight, in your imagination, it will move. This is the extraordinary thing, that it won't stay still. If you just allow, you could even he had one patient who couldn't do active imagination at all. And he saw an image of a landscape that was in a train station on a poster. And he thought, it kind of depicted a hill with a path going around it. And he thought, I want to see what's on the other side of that hill. And so just by holding that static image, internally, he was then able to go up the path and behind the hill and discover what was there. And it was the first time he'd actually been able to engage with the practice. And so sometimes I'll encourage people, start with an image that you've seen. Maybe it's an image from a dream. Again, maybe it's an emotion, and you allow it to take a particular visual form within you. All those are good starting places. And then I will guide people through kind of inviting that forward. What colors do you see? Is a shape emerging? Is there a landscape around? What does it feel like? What does it smell like? Do you hear anything? And so I'll do it with questions, again, trying not to really lead, but to have something naturally emerge. And often for people, what will emerge is some kind of a figure, whether humanoid or animal or some other kind. And then they engage in conversation with them. And so I'll invite them, to ask if this being has anything to say. They may have to lend their voice to this emerging figure. So I have that practice. It's quite short. It's probably only lasts about 15 to 20 minutes. And then I'll guide people back out again, coming back into their bodies, kind of grounding in. And and then there's a multi-stage way of kind of bringing it back out. So first, I have the participants draw what they've experienced. And for a lot of people, that seems to continue the experience. If they're not talking with anyone else, they just sit down with a big sheet of paper and, oil pastels or something really simple like that. Carry it further. And then I'll ask them to write it down, which is a little bit more concrete, a little more objectified. And then I'll ask them to get into small groups, discuss it with 3 other people, and then finally we share it in the larger group. And as I said, the first time I did this, I thought, I have no idea if anything's going to happen. And I was blown away. It was a group of maybe 35, 40 people. Every single person had an experience.
Wow.
And a potent experience. And some people were crying and finding resolution to things that they had been struggling with. And it amazed me because clearly it wasn't me doing it. I was just holding the container. And what it felt like, and every time I've done this since with students in my classes, with workshop participants, again, it's the same thing where there's this sense of amazement that something even happens. People aren't taking a psychedelic. They're not, engaging in a really long practice. It's as though if we just create the right container and space for the psyche to speak, it wants to so badly. And if we allow that and create a way to engage it and then bring it back into this realm, there's really extraordinary gifts that can emerge. So that's the way that I developed to work with it. And I wouldn't say it's the only way. I wouldn't say it's a strict kind of Jungian way either. Because again, I just kind of pieced it together based on my own experiences, based on what I read of Jung's, and hoped it worked, and then have, since refined it as I've worked with more people around that.
What is it that separates those who experience it tremendously? You mentioned preliminary and not going deep. I'm curious about why not go deep, but we'll get to that.
Sure.
So what is it that separates those who actually go deep when you're trying to make it preliminary versus those who don't? Is this something like trait openness, or is it just that you gave them permission so they feel foolish? Their rational mind is trying to say, don't engage in this, but now you've licensed this practice to them. What is it?
Yeah. I think, that would be a really interesting study to do to kind of get in greater depth with the participants. The ones where I get the best kind of feedback around that are students who I'm working with for a whole semester, because I just get to know them better. And what's interesting is one piece you brought up is really important. When that critical faculty, the mind, kind of keeps jutting in and saying, well, this is ridiculous, or nothing's going to happen, or something's going to happen for everyone else, but not for me. And I found a very interesting split between people where that's very dominant. For some of them, it does really get in the way and they struggle. And somehow for others, the ones who are most skeptical or the most like, this isn't going to work for me, somehow it bursts through anyway. And I'm not sure why that is exactly. Maybe it's because for some of those people where the mental critical faculty is so dominant, the psyche is just kind of waiting to speak. Whereas with others, that interruption still becomes too strong. So there is a repressive effect. But I actually have found that it's for some of those people where there's that initial sense of, no, this isn't going to work for me, or it's going to work for everybody else, that they do end up having a very powerful experience, as though the psyche is saying, oh, finally, you're listening to me, or you're finally giving me space. The other people who do tend to have very immersive experiences are ones who maybe already have a similar practice, or who are in some way used to entering into expanded states of consciousness. And so they go, oh yes, I know how to do this. This is familiar. Yeah.
You mentioned that imagination, despite it having the root image, doesn't mean visual.
Okay.
And it could be conceptual, it could be emotional, it could be otherwise. Now, interestingly, smell is extremely primal, more primal than vision. Now, vision's much more developed in us, so maybe that's an answer to my question here. But why is it that archetypes appear so visually and not, say, olfactorily?
Well, I think that maybe they do, or maybe they're interconnected, because I know exactly what you mean, that when you smell something, I am a very visual person, by the way. So I had to overcome a lot of my own biases in learning about how other people experience imagination. But if I smell something where there's a memory attached, I will be dropped into a completely immersive visual experience that might be a memory. It might just be an internal experience of, oh, I can see this, which is very, I'm thinking of this scent that I smelled recently. A friend of mine has been developing a perfumery line, and I have images connected to every single one of those scents of things that I've never necessarily seen. There's maybe a little memory mixed in there, but mostly just an image that's evoked with these scents. So maybe they're not so disconnected as we think. Maybe we can invoke an archetypal experience in an olfactory way. But why is it that we do have at least this bias of thinking of imagination or archetypal experience as being so visionary, but in an internal state? I like this question because I don't feel like I have a really clear answer on it. And I think I have to force myself to get beyond my own biases or perspective on it. Because the visionary experience has been so strong for me, but I've encountered others who clearly have a rich imagination, but don't see in that sense. We so often used to use that phrase, seeing is believing. Doesn't really work anymore in terms of, how easily we can generate videos and so forth where we don't know what we're seeing necessarily. But I do wonder if there is some kind of connection to that, where one is experiencing an internal state, an expanded state, something that feels very real. And it's that visual component that really allows us to be aware of some other reality that's not the external world, but is maybe what we could call an inner world.
Was there something in the inner world that was, in scare quotes, objective, that Carl Jung saw and then psychologized it, and Tolkien saw and mythologized it?
Ooh, that's a good one. Well, let me just say what first came to mind with the question on Jung, and I might come to thinking of a parallel that does that. But Jung, one of the most extraordinary kind of early encounters that Jung has, that he records in the Red Book, is this encounter with the prophet Elijah and his daughter Salome. And this is the first time that he's really been in conversation with two figures, and they're helping him understand what's even happening here. And he gets overwhelmed. He's quite frightened at this point. And of course, Jung himself is thinking, have I unleashed a latent psychosis? What's happening for me? So he has a lot of fear, anger, resistance as he's talking to these figures. And as they're speaking to him about certain religious themes and so on, who he is, what his role is to play here, he really pushes back and he says, you are symbols. And they say, you can call us symbols if you want, in the same way that you could call your fellow human beings symbols, but that doesn't make us any less real. And they say that several times. We are real and we are not symbols. And I like to take those moments quite seriously, where the figures are actually saying to Jung, or if we have our own experience, saying, no, we're real. Okay, what does that mean? That there is a reality, an ontology to these figures. They're not literal or physical, but they have a reality to them. They're effective. And Jung does take that seriously on the one hand, but on the other hand, he psychologizes them, where he identifies the prophet Elijah as what he calls forethinking, and he identifies his blind daughter Salome as pleasure, or eventually as something more along the lines of emotion. The English translation of the word is pleasure in the Red Book. The German is die Lust, so other scholars have translated it as something more like desire. But it's kind of like this, one of them is seemingly symbolizing, as they're saying, we're not symbols, symbolizing thinking or the mind, and the other is symbolizing love or emotion or feeling. Out of that directly, Jung theorizes his psychological archetypes and the function of thinking and the function of feeling. And then two more eventually emerge to kind of complete the quaternity of sensing and intuiting. And those are his psychological types. And he publishes on them in 1921, kind of coming out of the Red Book period. So that's an example where he did take something directly out of his experience and psychologized it, was able to kind of put it more into a conceptual formula that you lose a lot of the kind of mythic experience of the original encounter. But psychological types is something that many people have found extremely valuable. Okay, I'm more of a dominant thinking type, or I'm more of a dominant feeling type, or sensing. So there really was a psychological gift that came out of that, even at the same time as these figures are saying to him, we are real and not symbols. So that was the first example that came to mind. In Tolkien's case, in terms of mythologizing something as opposed to psychologizing it, I'm not going to do an exact parallel here, but I think this is a helpful illustration. In Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, we have this extraordinary figure of Gollum, who is really two personalities in one body. And so Gollum, or Smeagol in The Lord of the Rings, this is actually a character that Jungians absolutely love, because they're like, oh, this is a great example of the ego and the shadow. And Gollum is the shadow who's become so dominant that the ego of Smeagol kind of gets swallowed up, but both are clearly there. They're both still struggling to be present. So we can, from a Jungian perspective, psychologize that character. But instead, for Tolkien, he just let it be a being, a very compelling figure who has captured the imagination of readers for the last several decades. And I think there is a value in the psychological interpretation, but there's a different kind of value in seeing this simply in the context of a story, of a living story.
Why were those two characters, or whatever we want to call them, resistant to being called symbols, to symbolizing them, but then you can psychologize them, make them into somehow psychological archetype instead of symbolic archetype? To me, symbolic is much more rich than just psychologizing. Or maybe that wasn't the connotation at Jung's time. Did they feel like it would demean them? Elijah would be a mere symbol, or what?
I think it is along those lines. There's another figure that the same thing happens with in a later fantasy that Jung has. He encounters this young girl in a castle. And again, he's quite resistant to her. He says, "Oh, you're very fairy tale-like." And he doesn't like being in this fantasy because it reminds him of so many, kind of fairy tales or romance novels that he is disparaging of at the time. And she also insists, she says, "I'm real. Would you undercut my reality?" And therefore kind of undermining her being. And I agree with you that symbol is a kind of mediation between, let's say, an archetypal reality and kind of being able to translate it into our lived experience. And that is different than psychologizing, which can sometimes really flatten things like, oh, this is just that. But I think what these different figures, the young girl in the castle, Elijah, Salome, and the others are saying when they're trying to make clear that they're real is something along the lines of, you can't reduce us to either something you've already encountered in the external world that we're a symbol of, and also you can't reduce us to your own individual personality. I'm not just a facet of you. I have my own agency and being that you need to come into relationship with. And when we allow for that, then something really profound can emerge.
Are the archetypes real beings or patterns that then become experienced as beings?
I would say that it's so tricky to define archetypes. And, when we read Jung on archetypes, it can sometimes feel like he's being inconsistent because he's describing them as these, sometimes more along the lines of beings, as something that is along the lines of a biological instinct, something that's a mythic pattern. Can kind of be like, well, what does he mean? Is it myth? Is it biology? Is it instinct? Is it transcendent? And I think the reason it can feel so contradictory is because archetypes are all of those things all at once. And I think that ultimately they can be understood as beings or as agencies. But when I say beings, I don't even want to reduce that to, and this is even hardly a reduction, but I don't even want to reduce that to a personified form. So we can think of, say, the deities of all the world's mythic and religious pantheons as embodiments or personifications of archetypes. And there's something even beyond those forms that is informing them, that is shaping them, that seems really clearly to be alive and have agency, but is so multivalent, is so kind of iridescent in its spectrum of manifesting itself that we can't ever even quite say it's a being. It's almost beyond a being, or beyond a personified being, as it were. And so we can encounter archetypes at all these different levels, whether that's in a more mythic deity form, whether it's in the form of more of a psychological archetype or archetypal figure that we're talking about more in this realm of imaginal experience like Jung is having. The interesting thing about encountering archetypes is that as we learn to perceive them, we can even kind of recognize them in our daily experience in the world around us. For example, beauty, which Plato was so kind of committed to as one of the three great archetypal principles, beauty, truth, and goodness. Mm-hmm. We can recognize that archetypal principle of beauty in anything that we find beautiful in our lives, whether that's a work of art or an exquisite landscape or someone we're in love with. We see that beauty. Those are different concrete examples, but there's something informing them. And now some would say, well, you can just abstract that idea of beauty from these things, and it's just part of the human mind. And that's been mostly the modern approach to understanding universals. If we think of something along the line of Kant's a priori categories. It's like, okay, it's internal to the human mind. It's structuring how we see the world. This was initially how Jung started off viewing things. But the more one engages with these archetypal principles, especially in expanded states of consciousness, such as active imagination or other ways of opening one's consciousness or entering into non-ordinary states, the more I think it does seem to become clear that, oh no, there's a profound agency here at work that is beyond something that's just in the human mind that we can abstract, that's part of the world itself. So I often say that at the end of the day, I'm a Platonist, in the sense that I do not just believe, but have experienced that sacred, transcendent reality of archetypal principles, and cannot only see them as categories of the human mind or of the human psyche even, but something of the world itself.
Tell me about some of those experiences.
Well, I think the one that was most transformative for me happened, this was over a decade and a half ago now, and this was a psychedelically mediated experience. And I had been learning about archetypes for about a year intensively at this point. But it was still something conceptual. I would read someone like Jung, or I would read my own father's work, Richard Tarnas's work on archetypes, and he traces out a history of archetypes in his book, The Passion of the Western Mind, from Plato through Jung and beyond, to James Hillman in Archetypal Psychology, to Stan Grof in Transpersonal Psychology. So he kind of traces this long lineage of archetypes. So I was learning this. This was the year between when I went to when I finished undergrad and before I started graduate school, and yet it was something like, I get it conceptually, but I didn't know what the experience of it was like. I didn't know what the experience of it was like, and the best metaphor I can give for the shift is when you go from not being able to read. So when, it's, for many of us, we learn to read fairly young, and you look at words on a page before you can read, and they are, you see the shapes, you might know the letters, but you can't it takes some work, or you may not even know at all what you're looking at. Then you learn to read, and your eye just lands on something that's written, and you immediately know what it's saying to you. It was that level of shift where I was in this expanded state of consciousness, and it actually came in the form of planetary archetypes, or you could say the deities or archetypal principles that are associated with the planets as used by archetypal astrologers. And so in this state, I started to have this experience of all of these entities, energies, agencies trying to speak to me all at once. And when I say speak, I mean there was a kind of vocal component, but it was also very visual, all internal, but kind of activating all the senses at once. Even the olfactory in some ways, but it was completely chaotic. And so I said, and it was this feeling like all the archetypes were so excited that I was ready to listen to them, that they all wanted to tell me who they were at once. And I said, please come one at a time. And this was the framework at the time that was most accessible to me, was this kind of planetary archetypal framework. And so they did. And one at a time, the archetypal principle associated with the sun and then the moon, they each one at a time presented themselves in this kind of symphony of visual, sight, sound, kind of, again, I keep using the word immersive today, this immersive experience where it was like I'd stepped to the other side of a veil, and now I could see, oh, this is what the people who are describing these archetypes as meaning are talking about, because you could just take in a list of words. Okay, the archetypal principle of Venus relates to love, beauty, sensuality, sexuality, aesthetics, art, and so forth. And I could kind of see that as a breakdown of individual words, but all of a sudden they became unified. I was like, oh, now I see that unified principle of how beauty and love and sensuality and aesthetics and the arts and so forth all relate to each other, that it is one thing. And it was after that experience that, like reading, I suddenly started seeing them in a completely, you could say, ordinary state of consciousness, started seeing them in the world, and could never unsee them from that point on, where I could suddenly recognize beauty with a capital B in a new way, or I could recognize that archetypal principle of Mars within fire and athletics and violence and anger and assertion and aggression. I could see it all at once of, oh, there's that principle. And that for me was the moment, that shift from, okay, this isn't just something abstract. This isn't something that we can only access cognitively, but it's deeply experiential. And there's a someone behind each of these principles. So that's one of the experiences that really led to that transformation.
What's an example of something that didn't have beauty before, and then after this experience, you then noticed the beauty that was always there, or is now imbued with beauty?
I remember I was in Prague, and I was looking, Prague is such an exquisite city. And I think, and actually, I had been to Prague before this experience, and then several years later, I went back after this experience. And the difference was, it wasn't that I couldn't recognize that something was beautiful, but it would just be more of a sense of like, oh, I find that beautiful, or that form is lovely, or I find that aesthetically pleasing. It was all very in the specifics of what I was looking at. Whereas after this experience, it was as though that principle of beauty was actually glowing through everything that I saw. So it's not that I could separate it from the particulars or see it as something different, but it was as though that principle of beauty was actually alive within everything that I found to be beautiful. And actually, that was the moment in Prague. I remember walking down the street and seeing these beautiful buildings in the Art Nouveau style, and there were flowers and the cobblestones. And the thought that went through my mind was, Plato was right, that I could perceive the living beauty coming through everything, and how it wasn't just in the particulars, that it was kind of behind and saturating through all of it. But you couldn't take any of those particulars away and then see it. It wasn't a separate reality. It was living as part of all of those things. And I felt like I could enter into almost a direct relationship through it, kind of participating with all that was beautiful around me.
Now, see, I think my first question was, what did you discover between Jung and Tolkien?
Mm-hmm.
I used that word discover.
Yeah.
And then throughout this, we've talked about how discovery is not so straightforward. It's not as if that thing is there and then you find it. Participation may be a third. So did you create this connection between Tolkien and Jung, or did you participate in it? Like, help me understand that.
Yeah, this was something that was so helpful that my dissertation committee actually guided me to see, where I was at first I was just laying out the parallels. I was like, look, these are so interesting. And they said they are. And you are drawn to recognizing particular parallels because of who you are and because of your life experiences and interests and aesthetic sensibility and so forth. And that was a very important moment for me of realizing I was the third piece between Jung's experiences and Tolkien's experiences, because I was having experiences where I was seeing the parallels between the two. And while I wrote that dissertation just with, my 3 committee members to reflect it to me, and I've since been able to teach on it. And I've guided students reading through Jung's Red Book and Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings and other parts of his legendarium in tandem. And they see things that I never saw. As soon as they point them out, I go, oh, of course that makes sense. Of course there's a parallel there. But I completely missed them because it either wasn't something I was drawn to, or it didn't kind of align with my own experience, but it aligned with these students. And so we've actually started uncovering even more parallels between the two. There's plenty of parallels as well that I didn't include in when I wrote this up as my dissertation or any of the lectures I've given on it, because I felt like they weren't concrete enough, but I could still see them. So my copy of Jung's Red Book, for example, the marginalia is filled with additional parallels that probably only I can see. And so I have to take my own perception, my own imaginal experience into account with that. And I think that is why these parallels stood out to me, because my own imagination was activated in relationship to them. So yeah, that basically to answer that question. Now, what has been very interesting to observe is when I've spoken about this subject, to Jung societies or in classes, to see where other people see it too. So it's not just me alone seeing it. And that's always the fear every time you get up and you're like, look, I found these parallels. If someone's going to say, well, I don't see any of them. But that hasn't happened. It's been people also recognizing them and having that same sense of wonder and awe in relationship to it. And I think part of it is it's just interesting to see Tolkien and Jung are such giants in their fields. To kind of uncover these parallels between the two is kind of fascinating. But also, I think it's because for those of us who do engage with it, it taps into something deep, like, oh, I see those things too. And I think that's ultimately been why I've continued pursuing this work, that it's not, yes, it's about Jung and Tolkien and the parallels between the Red Books, but really it's about awakening people to their own imagination, to their own relationship to the inner world, to the imaginal world, saying this is something you have access to as well. And I think that's where the great joy and kind of gift has come out of this work, is allowing others to affirm their own imaginal capacity. Like, yes, this is something that is your cosmic birthright in some ways.
Is there a reason you say universal and not objective?
Objective to me seems to indicate a removal of the observer, where something is kind of existing fully separate from us. And I don't necessarily know if that's possible, because we're always participating as witness. I would say something along the lines of a consensus reality. So not objective in the sense of it's over here and it exists whether or not anyone is engaging with it. Because what do we even mean by anyone? Do we mean just human beings, or the cosmos itself is maybe witness to itself? I mean, that's a big claim. But I think that's why I wouldn't necessarily say objective, whereas I think you can recognize something like consensus of multiple. Did you see that? Did you have that kind of experience? Oh, yes, I did too.
Like intersubjective agreement.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, one of the reasons I was asking that is because you mentioned that you want to remove some biases. And then what I'm thinking of is, well, what is this objective Becca that you measure yourself against to say that you're less biased now?
Right. Yeah.
What's wrong with the Becca that's in front of me, right? Why are you trying to change yourself and be unbiased or be less like Becca to be more like a true Becca? What is this?
Oh, I like this question. I think that there's not necessarily an objective Becca, but I would like there always to be an evolving and growing Becca. And so the more I can see through my complexes, my biases, my prejudices, my assumptions, then who I am and what I can perceive in the world and what I can engage with in the world expands. That I can take in more, I can relate to more, I can empathize with more if I can see beyond not who I am in a complete sense, but who I have been up until this point. And I think we can recognize that in a very simple way too, just when we look back on, decisions that we made in our teens or in our 20s, or, kind of looking back on different phases of life of, oh, why did I do it that way? Or why did I have that perspective? Or how did I completely miss that was what was happening? Because our perspective is narrower. And as we grow, and I would say work on ourselves psychologically, emotionally, empathically, relationally, we can broaden that lens and include more of others' perspectives. And by others, I don't just mean human beings, but, all Earth species, kind of a cosmological perspective. So that's kind of more what I mean, that there isn't necessarily an objective perfect Becca I'm striving for who's unbiased, but just one who's continuing to grow and to be able to see beyond where I currently am or where I have been.
So you mean adding more perspectives?
I think so. Yeah. Adding more perspectives and adding more perspectives in a relational sense, in a sense of being able to empathize with more and more people's beings' experiences.
Does that ever make you feel like you're not enough?
All the time. I think the other side of that can definitely feel like, my husband will be the first to point this out. I'm terribly hard on myself. And sometimes I probably would do better to move in a direction of not being so biased against myself, as it were. So yeah, that's something I face pretty much daily.
When Jung went and had his first imagination encounter or active imagination, apologies if I'm misusing the terms.
No, you're doing it beautifully.
You said that he was frightened because he wasn't sure if he was experiencing psychosis or something like that.
Yeah.
So, gosh, there are two questions here. One is I want to know about your cautionary tales, because you've talked about a beautiful experience. But additionally, I want to know about people who are more hard-nosed and left-brained would hear what's being said right now and just think, okay, but what's separating this from just psychosis or being hypnotized or just imagining? Like I can imagine a ball, I can imagine a person, I can imagine anything I like.
Yeah.
So in science, that's why it's important that I was wondering the word objective, which in science, the word objective has some particular meaning. You should be able to replicate to be able to make an objective claim and have randomized trials and so on and so forth. But these aren't precisely objective claims that you're making. So there must be some other method that you use to determine whether something is a genuine connection, a genuine experience versus a spurious one.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's where doing that deep inner work is really important. And as I said at the beginning, kind of being honest with oneself, because when we're dealing with the inner world, when we're dealing with the psyche, so Jung working with psychology, it isn't as clear cut as when you're working with something that is physical and in kind of in the outer world, where you can have more of that objective stance. Even in those contexts, though, we always have to take the scientist's experience into account. But you can absolutely be more objective in a way that you just simply can't when working with imagination, with the psyche. And I will say that it's very tricky to draw that line, and to say, okay, well, this is an imaginal experience. I'm using that term from Henri Corbin, who says that the imaginal is where something real emerges through the imagination that's beyond the individual, versus imaginary, which is, as you were saying, something that's simply made up. I can just imagine whatever I want. He uses imaginal along the lines of something more like visionary experience. And there is a subjective confirmation that comes with that, where there's a overwhelming feeling of veracity to whether it's a mystical experience or an imaginal encounter and so forth, that one feels like they can't alter it. You can't change what's emerged. It's just simply there. And in that way, there is a kind of objective quality to it. It can't be manipulated. Tolkien talked about this in his own strange way. He invented languages. He invented 14 languages, actually, but the two most developed were these beautiful Elvish languages. And he talked about what he called ghost words. And there were these words that would emerge with the sound and the meaning accompanying each other. And so he knew exactly what it meant. And as he would invent his languages, make up these languages, there would be these certain words that had emerged within him that he couldn't change. He couldn't change the sound. He couldn't change the meaning. It would feel like he was doing a kind of falsity to them. Whereas others, no problem. He could make it up, arrange things. He was an extraordinary expert at grammar and evolution of languages and so forth. But he knew these ghost words he couldn't manipulate. And I think it's similar, where we can have experiences where we can't change them. We just know that that's happened. And it may be sometimes they may be quite uncomfortable, or showing us a particular sense of truth, whether that's about ourselves or about the divine or anything in between, where we just know. I think that's where we get that term Gnosis, as the Gnostics speak about. We just know. And that's something that's very hard to translate to someone who hasn't necessarily had that experience or has denied that experience. Maybe that's part of why I'm so drawn to do this work, is that I think a lot of people have had experiences like this, maybe even just once or twice in their life, but their worldview forces them to deny it. Say, well, I had this odd experience, but... Mm-hmm. And then we kind of dismiss it. It was just a fantasy. It was just something I made up, when some little part of them knows that's not necessarily true. But it is really hard to differentiate. I've had experiences in my life that I've made important decisions around, very important decisions around, and then later thought, was that true? Was that the best idea? And questioning it. And then as more time passes, I'll realize, oh, this is actually part of a much larger context that I just couldn't understand in that middle phase. And sometimes that's not the case, or maybe I'm still in the middle of the story. I think these unfold over a lifetime. But I think that continuous sense of doubt and skepticism is actually really, really important to validating the truth of these kinds of experiences. So you say, is it true or is it not? Was that real or was it not? And if some inner part of you keeps saying, yes, it is, keep listening, that's important to pay attention to. But there's also that part of us that's like, no, I'm just really wanting this to be true. And that's when we have to get honest with ourselves. And those can be very heartbreaking moments too. And I've certainly been through my share of those as well. just to add that in terms of cautionary experiences, Jung would say that one has to be careful with the practice of active imagination because it can take the patient too far away from reality. And I think that is, when he was worried about having a latent psychosis unleashed, and he knew what that looked like. He'd worked with many schizophrenic patients at the Berghölzli and in his early medical practice. And so it was a very real fear and kind of, overexposure to patients and so forth of like, oh, this is happening to me too. And I think what he came to, and what I would agree with, is something along the lines of what Joseph Campbell said, just paraphrasing, that the psychotic drowns in the waters that the mystic swims through with delight. And the waters aren't different. It's, can we swim through them? Can we reemerge? Can we bring them back into our more objective or consensus reality or not? And that's more the risk. And I think this is why Jung was cautious with something like active imagination, that if someone was a little too porous or was a little too hard to come back, that's not a safe method, because you might get stuck there, or you might become overly paranoid, or see symbolic images everywhere and not be able to come back to something that's more more objective, more kind of a shared consensus with others based in a more physical reality. Yeah.
Curt here. Note that if you'd rather listen to Toe, we're on Spotify, iTunes, everywhere with a podcast catcher. You can just search my name or Theories of Everything. And also, remember to hit subscribe. Is it true that Carl Jung was once asked about Nietzsche and why did Nietzsche go mad and not you, Carl? And then Carl said, well, Nietzsche spent too much time in the air. And Carl himself, he was saying, I have patience, I have obligations, I have a wife, I have this and that. And so I ground myself. And in order for you to be extremely creative, you should also be extremely grounded in other areas.
Yes, he did have that concern about artists too, of feeling like some artists would kind of indulge in these states in a kind of bacchanalia and then not bring something back for the community or be able to translate it. And Jung did use those relationships and obligations in his life as a way to come back and be grounded. And as you said, it was his patients, it was his wife, it was his family, it was his military service. And I think most importantly, it was the figure of Toni Wolff, who was his muse. He called her his spiritual wife. They had what at the time was referred to as a left-handed marriage. His wife, Emma Jung, was quite aware of the relationship. It was difficult for her, but he had this second relationship with Toni Wolff, and she stood by him through his Red Book period. She was the person that he would bring his experiences to day after day. He'd kind of enter into these states of working with active imagination at night. He'd write them down, and then the next afternoon she would come to his home and they would discuss them and try and understand them and make sense of them. And she really was to use a mythic image, she was the Ariadne to his Theseus. She gave him the thread to come back out of the labyrinth. And interestingly, she had such a deep trust in the unconscious. She had such a deep trust in the psyche, but she was unable to do active imagination herself, which I think is so interesting. So she really offered that guidance and that support to him in a way that all those other figures did too. But she was essential, and her story isn't often told. So that's why I like to bring her into this as well.
Part of the reason that I talked to you about some of the caution is because I've had my own experiences. And I often say that my wife saved me, and she saved me in many, many ways. So the groundedness is definitely one. The BBC did a mini documentary on my, well, I'll just say experiences. And so it's so tricky because yes, there's the danger of drowning in the waters. There's also the twin danger of of dehydration, of people who have no meaning at all.
Yeah.
And so I see both of those. And my work has it such that I speak to people like you who all have different points. Speaking of perspectives, all have different perspectives, and I take them all seriously. I don't discount them as, okay, these are foolish people. But it spins my mind, and I'm still recovering from some events that happened many years ago. I was walking around downtown Toronto, and some people who are homeless, and they were just, one guy was just saying something like time, time, time. He was just saying time out loud, and everyone else just walking away from him and feeling like this guy is crazy. And I'm thinking, like, I know exactly, like, I can put myself in your state, and I feel so horrible for you, and I don't want you to trigger me, because I gosh.
I completely agree with you with that. And I think that part of what we see with psychosis is a lack of a worldview container that can help bring those experiences back and translate them out of a purely archetypal state into one that can be more deeply understood. And this is where what we were talking about earlier is so important, of psychologizing something or putting something into a form that we can kind of more concretely understand it. And, I'm hoping I'm remembering the story correctly, but I think Jung talked about a patient where she described her experience of living on Mars. And at first you would think, well, that sounds insane. She doesn't live on Mars. She's very clearly in this ward, in this mental hospital. But if you translate that into a kind of symbolic archetypal language, Mars is, whether we understand that as a planetary archetype or as a deity figure, Mars is the principle of violence, aggression, of anger. And if someone says, I live on Mars, and it sounds literal, then it sounds insane. But if we read that symbolically, I live on Mars may feel like, I grew up in a home that was very violent or filled with anger, or there was a lot of aggression. But for whatever reason, there may not be a capacity to translate that back into a language where more people can understand it. And so it is a very kind of tricky balance in terms of, well, where is the line? And the line can be and is quite fluid. And some people are just much more sensitive to entering into those states and having trouble coming back than others. I think probably part of why I've been quite interested in this work is because it is easier for me to come back. But I've worked with students, I've worked with workshop participants where it's harder for them to come back. And so I want to be more cautious working with people like that of yes, affirming the reality of those experiences, but also trying at least to teach those methods of entering back into this realm of embodied, relational, physical, more literal space as well.
Gosh, one of my favorite quotes is from H.P. Lovecraft. He said something like that one day this unfettered investigation into science may reveal such terrifying vistas of reality and our frightful position therein that we may flee from the light into the peace and safety of the darkness. And man, many people in this space, they talk about the more beautiful, the more majestic, the more life-giving aspects of these experiences. But I also see the Icarus flying too close from the sun.
Yeah.
There's another poet who said something that I resonate with so much. See, the person to Jung was saying, hey, I'm real, I'm not a symbol. For me, I would be like, oh my gosh, I have to treat you like a symbol, man. Like, I do not want you to be real. You are too real, if anything. I don't want that. So the quote is, God, please turn away from me so that I may stand.
Yeah,
there's
that's
something
beautiful.
Inundating about the pure sun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a reason that in so many myths we hear the gods have to veil themselves, to dim their light so that they can even relate to us. And that is, without us being overwhelmed or shattered by the experience. And I think that is where some of the participatory element comes in too. If we're trying to relate to archetypal principles, if we're trying to be in relationship to the gods, to use that term, then in evoking their presence in a way that they're clothed in a form that doesn't totally overwhelm us psychologically, emotionally, that it doesn't shatter us is very important. And I don't necessarily have a concrete way of doing that, but when we were speaking about the practice of active imagination, this kind of guided form that I've cultivated, I called it preliminary. And that's for exactly these reasons we're talking about. It's kind of, if you're in a weekend workshop, you just want to have a little taste of this.
Dip your toes.
Yeah.
Right.
And that if it's something you're wanting to work with longer term, that's important to do in the right container, whether that's working with a very experienced Jungian therapist or guide, or even in a community where everyone is holding one another accountable to that and kind of bringing back those experiences.
Now, let me ask you this. As a Jungian scholar, I'm sure you're aware that Jung was asked, why don't you take psychedelics? And then he said something like, beware of unearned wisdom.
Mm. Jung didn't need them, first of all. Yeah, he did not need them. He had that capacity himself. And, I know that there are multiple religious, spiritual, mystical figures, leaders, and so forth, who have had that view of psychedelics where they are opening us up into experiences and realities that, again, can be very hard to bring back, to integrate. And I think that there's a reason that in psychedelic scholarship right now, there's been so much interest in integration, not just the experience, but, okay, how do we actually fold this into our everyday lived reality now? And so that kind of beware of unearned wisdom is an important caution. At the same time, if one is raised and educated in a very materialist culture that denies the reality of any inner experience, then something like psychedelics, which interestingly, come to us in a material form.
Right.
As Stan Grof said, he's like, Stan Grof, the pioneering LSD researcher, said that, maybe the avatar had to come in a material form, in a chemical form, in order for the message to come through. Because for some people, that's the only way to enter into that kind of state of consciousness and take it seriously. So I think it depends on the context, it depends on one's worldview, and what barriers do or don't need to be broken down in order to enter into these kinds of experiences.
Can I ask you a foolish question?
It probably isn't foolish, but please.
For Becca, for you, when will it be enough? What I mean to say is it may be a foolish question, like, Curt, you should go to the gym. Are you going to ask, when do you stop brushing your teeth? Like, obviously you do. There's some practices you do every day. And if you don't, you start to weaken. So is it like that you, professor, have to engage in these practices, or you want to, maybe not have to, but in order to continue to feel meaning? Or do you then see, both of us were super, super lucky. Mm-hmm. We're super lucky that we both have jobs where we love our jobs. We both wake up, probably just can't wait to get to work. We can also take our work with us, that it integrates with our life so that we can shut off. But also, if we're walking in the forest, I'm sure you also get ideas. You can just look at the trees and get ideas. There's some mathematicians that I speak to that I say, go to this museum or do so. They say, other than just it making their mind wander, they won't get ideas. They can't look at a painting and then get some formula for whatever they're working on. But for myself, for yourself, we can take almost all aspects of life, and it's so beautiful, and life is so worthwhile. I'm just wondering, is that something that you then live with, or is it something that, like Pokemon cards, you have to keep accumulating more perspectives, you want your collection to grow, or what is it?
I love that question. Definitely not a foolish question, because it really makes me reflect on it. And what I have noticed in my life, it was in my early 20s that I first started doing any work with psychedelics, with expanded states of consciousness, also with holotropic breath work, which is a way of expanding one's consciousness through breathing without taking any substances. And I had so many profound, life-changing experiences. I wouldn't be where I am today without those experiences. And as the time has passed, I've been drawn to less and less extreme ways of engaging with those expanded states. And so, first came in active imagination following that and realizing, Jung was talking about something that allows us to go into these states, but it's much more subtle. It's much simpler and less kind of catalyzing than a psychedelic experience. And then now I'm in a phase of my life. I have a 2-year-old son. I'm currently 7 months pregnant with my next child.
Congrats.
Thank you. And so I've been in this much more, you could say, sober state in terms of, I don't drink alcohol. I mean, obviously I'm pregnant, so I haven't even had caffeine
Right.
in a long time. But I've been very, very kind of pure when approaching my pregnancies. And what I've noticed is that my engagement with the imaginal, it's more subtle, but it's let me simultaneously realize how much that's always there. That, the images, they're just always kind of appearing no matter what. I finally had to explain to my husband, I was like, when you come in the morning and tell me about the intense news that's happening somewhere in the world, I'm having a fully immersive experience of that bombing or that war or that massacre. And I maybe can't handle it when I first wake up. I need that a little bit later in the day. And so he's kind of learned about that internal experience that I have through those kinds of conversations. So while intentionally or actively eliciting very intense or engaged expanded states of consciousness has decreased in my life as I've gotten older and oriented more toward family and so on. They've also become more just integrated in the day-to-day. And I will say giving birth is probably the most profound expanded state of consciousness I've ever entered into. And I'm so grateful I had all those experiences to be able to guide me through the birthing experience. That it actually allowed me to really trust the unfolding process of the birth and to, have the visual experiences, the somatic experiences, know the breathing techniques by kind of allowing myself to be in that more liminal state. So when will it be enough? I think it's more of a question of how does engaging with the imaginal realm and with the archetypal align with whatever stage of life I'm in that's most appropriate for that time. And in a totally different way, I'm glad I have those experiences behind me when raising my child, because I can see how alive his imagination is at age 2 and really cultivate it. It also, now I understand why they call it babysitting. It's like sitting for someone on psychedelics, but they're an infant or a toddler. They're just experiencing the world in that same kind of porous way. But I think where, what I personally have been aspiring towards, and I don't talk about this often, but I'll always be deeply inspired by Tolkien, by storytellers, by people who tell archetypal stories, who tell myth. And that's really what I'm ultimately wanting to tell, to create, to write, are stories. And I'm currently more in an academic phase of my life, but I think that's what I'm moving towards. And maybe that's when it'll be enough, as it were. When I've been able to finally tell those stories in the form that I want to tell them. And then we'll see what comes after.
What depths have you gleaned from Harry Potter?
I grew up with Harry Potter. I was 10 when the first book came out, so I've read those books over and over, and I've there's a lot of different things that I've gleaned from those books. Um, on the one hand, I think probably like many people, many children reading them, there's of course the challenge of feeling like, oh, magic doesn't work the way that it's described in this, at least for me. Um, and then much later in life, realizing that maybe something quite different is meant by magic, that we can engage with it, but it doesn't look like the wand waving in Harry Potter. It looks something like learning to align ourselves with the synchronicities that unfold in our lives. But I mean, I think it's a work of very engaged and inspiring storytelling. There's some really profound patterns that she's woven in to the stories that I love how she works with language, with myth, how the names are all kind of, they encapsulate who the person is without telling you. And if you happen to know Latin, or if you happen to know the mythic reference that is there, then you get a revelation of that character. So I personally, I love how it's composed, and it's one that's been quite inspiring to me over the years. I don't know as much about her writing process in the way that I know about Tolkien's, where he describes that sense of something coming through, versus constructing something. And I think she's woven a very compelling plot across 7 books. But it's definitely something that shaped me from childhood on.
Mm-hmm. What's the difference between your worldview and Bernardo Kastrup's idealism?
I don't know Kastrup's work well enough to be able to answer that. His name keeps coming across my awareness, just especially within the last year. And so I feel totally inadequate to answer that, unless you want to unpack it a bit for me first.
Okay, what about general idealism? Like the view that all there is mind, and that what you are, what your friends are somehow avatars of this mind, almost like eddies in an ocean.
I like to affirm the reality of both the one and the many, of both mind and matter. On the one hand, I do agree and have had experiences that seem to affirm that sense of divine oneness, that we're all kind of emanations of that divine oneness, or that we've forgotten our origins, and that's how we're able to be part of creation, to be individual beings. But I don't espouse the view that this world, or our individual experience, is somehow just an illusion, that it is something that ultimately doesn't matter because we're really one, or we're mind only. I think that affirming being embodied, being individuals, being separate in some ways is just as important as recognizing that unity and oneness. So in a very inelegant term, I consider myself a bothist, where kind of try and hold both of those perspectives simultaneously, because I think
both but differentist.
Yeah, that it's by affirming our embodied experience, our sense of separateness, our physical reality, our psychological reality, that's how we grow too, and mature and evolve, and have a sense of individual responsibility and autonomy. And I think that's just as important as recognizing the ways in which we're transcendent and unified and imaginal beings as well.
I want to know, do you find most of the meaning seems to be created from connections? You notice that so-and-so is a parallel. But what about disconnections?
something that I said at the end of my dissertation on Jung's and Tolkien's Red books was to be very clear, these are not the same books, and that we can learn a great deal from their differences as from their parallels. And yes, I've spent this time laying out the parallels, but the differences are important because these are two different people who had radically different experiences and made different choices about how to express them. And so those differences, those disconnections, I think that actually speaks to what I was saying a moment ago, which makes sense why this question would emerge, that it's being able to recognize our differences, our diversity, the ways we can't always see eye to eye, that then allows us to, as I was saying before, kind of expand ourselves of, oh, wow, you actually see the world so differently than I do. And I can learn from that and be challenged by it and disagree with it. Or, again, I think that's part of our incarnated experience, is encountering those differences and disconnections and disagreements. And then can we handle it with grace? Can we handle it with an ability to meet that person or that idea or that disconnection somewhere that maybe won't perfectly align in the middle, because that's kind of the point of a disconnection, but that we can understand it or sympathize with it or have a sense of, oh, I see where you're coming from.
Is your husband as airy, as floaty as you are, and abstract, or does he ground you?
He is definitely more kapha to my vata and pitta, but he sees archetypes in the way that I do, which is a wonderful thing to be able to share with someone. So we do spend a lot of time talking about philosophy and spirituality. I would say he's much more, we talk about how he kind of comes more from a spiritual background. I come more from a background of psyche and imagination, and we've met in the middle. But I would say he's far more grounded than I am when it comes to orienting in the geopolitical situation of the world.
Interesting.
Yeah, and on a very practical kind of day-to-day level of being able to just attend to the physical things that need to be dealt with in the house, in our lives, and so on. And that being said, he's the one who's taught me to be much more emotionally attuned and empathic. I'm much more of a thinker. He's much more of a feeler. So we each carry different sides, and I think ground each other in different ways. Yeah.
So you mentioned psyche.
Mm-hmm.
Firstly, let's distinguish psyche from mind. You talked about that earlier in the conversation, but I want to know what truly that distinction is.
That's a great question. And so psyche is, it's the Greek word for soul, and seems to be the capacity within us to feel, to imagine. It is you could say, the internal dwelling place of the archetypal principles. Whereas mind is a capacity that's developed, that's much more rational, cognitive, that mental faculty that is able to kind of think through something. Psyche can be, I think, both rational and irrational, and is a much harder capacity to even pin down. And part of what's so tricky when defining psyche is that we can speak about it as, oh, we each have our own individual psyches. We have our own individual kind of soul and way of orienting to our emotions, our complexes, the way we express ourselves. But as whether it's Jung or James Hillman or others, will speak of psyche in a more universal sense, of Now, Jung talked about the objective psyche, which is another way of describing the collective unconscious. The psyche is kind of the interiority of the world itself. There's the beautiful term anima mundi, the world soul, that kind of describes that as well. And so we can talk about the individual soul, or individual psyche, and the collective psyche, or the world soul, the anima mundi, kind of like a part and whole. The mind, now you do get the same thing with the mind too. People will talk about the universal mind, for example, as a way of speaking of the divine.
I've never heard that.
Sometimes like the universal mind or the cosmic mind. These are terms that will either come out of mystical or religious experiences, and I don't want to disagree with anyone's way of using those terms, because I think it's speaking to kind of like a universal or cosmic intelligence. But coming back to our individual human level, I would say that there's an intelligence to the mind and there's an intelligence to psyche that's different. They're both ways of knowing and perceiving, but the mind we use in a much narrower capacity, and we. Our contemporary education systems really focus on honing the mind, honing that thinking capacity through everything from reading, writing, mathematics, the sciences, and so on, while not always accounting for the fact that the psyche is probably informing that unconsciously. So whether that's being unconsciously influenced by our psychological complexes, or how our emotions enter into the way we think or shape our biases. They're always kind of working in tandem, but we don't train one and we really train the other. And that's why I like to differentiate them. And that's why I think that practices such as active imagination or any of the arts in some ways allow us to, or working with our intuition, allow us to train the psyche, to learn to perceive and imagine and so forth in a way that's a little bit more conscious and a little bit more rational, that it can then work in tandem with the cognitive mind. And so, there's wonderful examples of scientific breakthroughs that have happened where the scientist has an intuition first, or they imagine something first, or even a dream that then they go to confirm using their rational mind and kind of verifying it with physical facts or mathematics and so on. That's the two working in conjunction. But we so often leave that part out of the story, that moment of kind of getting the vision and then verifying it. And so that's really what I'm interested in, is how do we get these two to work more in tandem, rather than saying, well, this is the real one, the rational mind. This is the one we can trust. And then this is like a whole messy nonsense that I don't even know how to begin to engage with. That feels a little dangerous to me, honestly, because then you have people thinking they're making rational decisions about whether it's science, politics, or anything else, without accounting for that role of the psyche and knowing how they're being influenced by it.
What do you mean?
Well, if one is making, say, let's say a decision that is going to affect many people, without taking into account their emotions around the subject, maybe their traumas that they're carrying, complexes that developed from early childhood, or maybe even beyond that, and it's shaping why they're making this policy decision, but they're not looking at why they might be making it. That feels dangerous to me, or why we would be, whether it's denying certain groups of people rights, or making decisions about how we treat the environment based on motivations that we're not deeply aware of, whether maybe it's greed because we were undernourished as a child or something like that. I think that that's very important to actually be able to do the work of looking at those deeper psychological motivations behind our so-called rational decisions so that the two can work in tandem. Yeah.
Speaking of deeper psychological motivations, what is the shadow?
The shadow is, in Jung's definition, it's the part of our egoic consciousness, so the part of us that says, I am Becca, this is my identity, this is, how I present myself in the world. The shadow is the part of that that's everything we are that we have denied or we won't look at. And the thing that's very apparent about the shadow, pretty much everyone else can see your shadow better than you can. To ask one's spouse is probably the best way to get to know your shadow. And so it's more important, more apparent to others than to ourselves. And also often things that trigger us and other people, like, oh, that person, like, that really bothers me.
Right.
Is usually related to part of our shadow, which is, again, is a repressed part of our identity. And so those are two kind of key indicators. If you really want to work on bringing the shadow or the repressed or forgotten or hidden parts of our sense of self or identity to the fore, integrating them, ask the people closest to you who you can trust to be honest with you of what those are, because they know. And also pay attention to those moments where you feel really bothered by someone else and be like, do I do that? Or am I so bothered by them because they're doing something that some deep primal part of me really wants to do right now? So those are kind of two key ways to get to know the shadow, and why it's important to be aware of the shadow and to try and integrate it into our conscious awareness is because if we're repressing it, it's still a part of our identity that's acting without our conscious awareness. And that's when we often make bad decisions that we then try and justify to ourselves or say, oh, that wasn't really me, I didn't do that, or that's not part of who I am, and yet we're acting from that place. So the shadow isn't necessarily always a bad thing, but it's something that we haven't included in our identity that is clearly part of it. Yeah.
There's a quote from one of Aesop's fables. It's, "We mortals scorn what we valiantly strive for but don't obtain." So I found that motivates me often, is that whenever I find that I'm deriding something, I almost invariably, it's because of jealousy or envy or covetousness or something like that.
Yeah.
Anyhow, what's, speaking of meaningful coincidences, a couple minutes before this podcast, I have two books on my desk. One of them is this Leonardo da Vinci notebook.
Oh, beautiful.
So it's all his sketches and then transcribed his writings. And I just flipped through it randomly. And I landed on something, and it said, "Light and shade." And this is Leonardo da Vinci's writings. "Shadow partakes of the nature of universal matter. All such matters are more powerful in their beginning and grow weaker towards the end. I say at the beginning, whatever their form or condition may be, and whether their form or condition may be, and whether visible or invisible."
Oh, it's beautiful.
Anyhow, I'll send this to you and I'll put this on screen. Maybe there's some, what Jungians would call synchronicities there.
No, that's beautiful. Hearing Leonardo da Vinci's reflection on shadow and how many ways we can take it. As you were reading it, of course, I'm hearing it through that Jungian psychological lens, but knowing him as an artist, as someone who was so observant of the world, of shadows in the world, that it's amazing to kind of hear it through all those different lenses simultaneously.
As I read through it, it's incredibly philosophical. And it's so interesting because I just didn't think that someone like him would speak so poetically.
Yeah.
"Darkness, then, is the strongest degree of shadow, and light is its least. Therefore, O painter, make your shadow darkest closer to the object that it casts, and make the end of it fading into light, seeming to have no end." Speaking of psychedelics, read that on Psychedelics and you'll get many insights.
That's wonderful. Oh, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing it.
Thank you so much for spending so much time with me, and congratulations again.
you.
And I've had a blast. Thank you for walking the audience through many of these insights and even some of these practices.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here, and I've so enjoyed this conversation. And just seeing where your mind goes with these questions is very beautiful. So thank you for allowing me to come speak with you.
Thank you. Take care.
You too. I hope it all made sense. Your questions are so good at getting to the heart of the matter that sometimes I was like, well, I hope I'm not leaving out important preliminary material. But I know that that's part of your technique of diving deep into the subject with your guests.
Hi there, Curt here. If you'd like more content from Theories of Everything and the very best listening experience, then be sure to check out my Substack at curtjaimungal.org. Some of the top perks are that every week you get brand new episodes ahead of time. You also get bonus written content exclusively for our members. That's CurtJaimungal.org. You can also just search my name and the word Substack on Google. Since I started that Substack, it somehow already became number 2 in the science category. Now, Substack, for those who are unfamiliar, is like a newsletter, one that's beautifully formatted. There's zero spam. This is the best place to follow the content of this channel that isn't anywhere else. It's not on YouTube. It's not on Patreon. It's exclusive to the Substack. It's free. There are ways for you to support me on Substack if you want, and you'll get special bonuses if you do. Several people ask me, like, hey, Curt, you've spoken to so many people in the fields of theoretical physics, of philosophy, of consciousness. What are your thoughts, man? Well, while I remain impartial in interviews, this Substack is a way to peer into my present deliberations on these topics. And it's the perfect way to support me directly. CurtJaimungal.org or search Curt Jaimungal Substack on Google. Oh, and I've received several messages, emails, and comments from professors and researchers saying that they recommend Theories of Everything to their students. That's fantastic. If you're a professor or a lecturer or what have you, and there's a particular standout episode that students can benefit from, or your friends, please do share. And of course, a huge thank you to our advertising sponsor, The Economist. Visit economist.com/toe, TOE, to get a massive discount on their annual subscription. I subscribe to The Economist, and you'll love it as well. Toe is actually the only podcast that they currently partner with, so it's a huge honor for me, and for you, you're getting an exclusive discount. That's economist.com/toe, TOE. And finally, you should know this podcast is on iTunes, it's on Spotify, it's on all the audio platforms. All you have to do is type in Theories of Everything and you'll find it. I know my last name is complicated, so maybe you don't want to type in Jaimungal, but you can type in Theories of Everything and you'll find it. Personally, I gain from rewatching lectures and podcasts. I also read in the comment that Toe listeners also gain from replaying. So how about instead you re-listen on one of those platforms like iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, whatever podcast catcher you use. I'm there with you. Thank you for listening.